Welcome back, everyone. I was just asked by several people what all I'd done to this Enduro 24 to upgrade it the way that it is, because this is the one that has climbed at 73 degrees with no body on it and different wheels. But I was just going for an overall climb record on that, and I'm going to call it unofficial because it didn't have a body on it. But several people have asked me what I've done to upgrade it. So I made a list to make sure that I remembered as many of them as I could for the video. And we'll start off with the outside of the car. Obvious things: it has mudslingers on aftermarket rims. I can't remember what they are. The front rims actually have some weight of some kind. I can't remember what I put in there, but they are weighted. I can't remember. It goes around the rim inside of the tire foams, and I think that's how I did it. It's been so long ago I don't remember. Other obvious things is I've cut the body just to clearance those big mudslinger tires. Then I added rear magnetic body mounts and shaved the posts, and that works pretty good. I just got tired of using a bunch of pins all the time. The other thing I did in the front was trim the bumper and relocate the lights, and the lights are now inside of here. There's one there and one there. I had to kind of drill those out a little bit to make them fit, but that was kind of a good thing to do because I think the lights were out here somewhere. That was one of my first mods. I don't even remember it that well. So then from there, this is one nice thing about having magnetic body mounts. Boom. You don't lose your pins. You just throw them in the bed and they stay there and they're ready for you later. And that's kind of a cool mod. I like that a lot. So once we get inside of the truck, it's completely different than it was from the factory. There's almost nothing in here that's the same other than the transmission and the frame. First and most obvious, I relocated the battery. I just cut a piece of Lexan and put Velcro on it, and that's where the battery sits. I can also side mount it over here on the outside of the frame if I'm going for a climb, and it kind of counterweights it a little bit and helps keep that left rear tire on the ground so it doesn't want to raise up when you're climbing. And it's still up where you can't see it. It's within the body, and it doesn't affect the ground clearance because you can Velcro mount the body as high as you want it. So that's a 2S battery. It has an SCx24 ESC, the AE6, because the stock Enduro one, it can hold 2S, but it doesn't modulate the ESC very well on 2S, and it will only last about a month, and then I found that they burn out, and generally will take the steering servo with it. It has the Fury Tech ESC. I have the Lizard in there, and I paired that with a motor from Nick at Wolfram RC, and I'll leave a link to that, his store, in the description, just where I got out. I'd like to give people credit who helped me, and Nick is awesome. Wolfram RC in general is awesome. Dan's a good guy, but that's he couldn't remember, was it 10,500 or 11,000 kV brushless motor, and it's necessary on this vehicle. I also have an Emax servo because when the stock servo blew up on 2S, it took the stock servo out with it. Another thing it has is springs that are softer. I can't remember where I got these springs. I think they came with some oh yeah, these are springs that came with my Kinetic double barrels, and this is kind of a hobby grade shock. They don't have any metal pistons or anything. It's all plastic. The only thing in it metal is the little, I don't know what you call it. It's a piece that slides in there and locks it into place so that it can't slide out of the top. Moving on from there to more suspension things. Maybe not so obvious is the rear suspension. You can see I cut the whole battery tray out. I've notched it, and having notched it out, that's where the battery used to sit, where those shocks are. So I cut that whole thing out and located my rear shocks inboard of the frame rails, and that gives you a lot of articulation. It really opened this thing up, and you can run a stiffer spring in there, because now it's more towards, you know, if these were dead center, all the spring would do is hold the body up. And I do want some spring rate. If you had one dead center, it would pivot freely with no issues. So I wanted to have a little bit stiffer spring rate, but not full stock spring rate, because full stock is way too stiff, and it would have zero droop, because they're just way too stiff of springs from the factory. Another thing I've done is I've added these here. I made this out of something. It was a piece of plastic from a package. I'm not sure what the package was, but what that is it extends up the shock mounting position, because I'll get to the deadbolt stuff later, but the back of this used to be where the shocks mounted, right here and here. And when I extended this wheelbase backwards, I needed something to be able to raise up and provide a place for the top shock to mount, the top of the shock to mount. Another thing you'll notice is these white, these were servo horns, but I needed something to be able to screw into, because I needed this shock tower that I created to be fastened on tight. So I've got servo horns that I cut. On this side I've only got one, because it only needed one. This screw went in and plenty tight, and it was fine. I am using the Enduro shock balls at the top, and this is a double ball system. This normally when you see a pivot ball, it's a single ball, but this has a shaft that goes to the ball, another shaft that goes to a second ball. I'd never seen that before in RC, but they do it, and it's pretty fortunate, because I was able to move my my shocks inboard far like that, and if they were out any further, they would strike the screws here. So I used these. I can't remember where they were on the body. I think they were on the front suspension before. And like I said before, save all the pieces, because you don't know when you're going to need something, and it makes a big difference. These nuts here are on the end of this is the stock pivot ball from the front, I believe. But anyway, the SCx24 wheel nuts are the perfect size to fit right on there. They screw right on. I couldn't believe it. It was so fortunate, and it was a really good thing, because these top mounts were kind of difficult to get in place, because unfortunately this plastic shock towers that I made, the plastic's a little soft. It's softer than I would have liked. I would like something a little more rigid, but it's what I had at the time, so I made them. And I did drill several holes in there so I could adjust the ride height if I choose. But as it turns out, I ended up creating those top holes when I didn't think I'd need to, but it really needed to be lower. The higher up on the shock tower you put it, the lower the chassis will sit. So I did that, and ended up putting them pretty much by accident at stock height here. So that's the shock towers. Let's see what else I got on my list here. Battery tray. Yeah, battery trays trim. Talked about that. One of the things that made this such a good truck over the stock ones, the stock Enduro, is I have Scx24 Axles. And when I put these on, it dramatically lowered the gear ratio, because a stock Enduro drive shaft spins very slowly, and it gets its speed from the gearing inside the diff. And that's the opposite of what you'd really ideally like to have, because it really puts a lot of torque load on the drive shaft. So ideally what you'd want is a fast drive shaft and a low gearing, and then the majority of the heavy lifting has to happen within the diff. And in this case it didn't. So it basically cut the gear ratio in half, and it made it pretty slow. But what I do is not trailing, it's rock climbing from what you've seen, and torque is way more valuable than really high speed for what I do. I've got high speed cars if I do need to go trailing. But I've done all the standard SCX24 things, a lot of them anyway. The brass diff cover, I went with +4 axles, and eventually I'm going to replace these silver spacers with the weights. I've got some that are on the way to me, and I forget how heavy they are, but it's probably like 12 or 13 grams. So I will replace that with those weights, and then inside there I've got hexes that I'm going to replace with regular style wheel weights. I don't have any to show you, but everybody knows what a wheel weight looks like. So I will add probably 20 grams aside to this, and then I'm going to also add weights inside of here to the back. And I probably have them somewhere. I've got stuff stashed all over the place because I don't throw anything away when it comes to this stuff. I end up needing it and using it eventually. I don't think it's a hoarder if you actually use what you hoard. But anyway, I kept the stock width in the back, because as you separate the tires farther and farther apart, you can have terrain features protrude up between the tires and catch the diff. And I just found out through trial and error that these work much better if you only do +4 on the front. You can see the difference. You know, it's much wider on the front than the back, and that is by design. It really helps out a lot. And the other thing about having a wide rear axle that I discovered as opposed to a narrow one, the farther out your wheel is, the more your thrust vector is farther away. And if one tire catches and one does not, suppose this one catches and that one doesn't, it's going to want to rotate the truck, the front of the truck, just because this side is the only side pushing. If you had centerline thrust, it could only push straight. But the farther out your wheel gets, the more you get asymmetrical forward thrust. Forward, I don't know what you call it other than thrust. But I just feel like this is a better setup with narrow on the back, because the back of this doesn't have the weight. The front of the truck is where the majority of the weight is. So the back just has to ride and push. So it's okay if this is narrower, because all it has to do is pivot. It's not really holding the side load stability that the front does. The fronts are very critical. If you have a lot of weight up front and it's not controlled well, it's going to just tip over. And because I've got so much weight in the front, it won't do that as easily. But the back just needs to pivot. That's all it just needs a push and pivot. And that's a philosophy thing, and you may have a different crawler philosophy, but this is what works on my course, so this is what I use. And let's see what else. I already talked about the brass diff covers, C-hubs, +4 axles. Talked about the width. Here's an interesting thing. When you go to build the steering, if you decide to do SCX24 components on the front, what I've done is I've cut the stock link mounts off. You know, it's got the, I can't know if let's see. It used to be right there. That's where the stock thing was, I believe. Anyway, I cut it off flush because I wasn't going to use the stock SCX24 style way to connect. So what I did was I held the wheel straight, and I tried various drag links here, and I couldn't figure out which one was going to be the best. And what ended up being the best was this is an upper suspension link from the back of the truck, this truck, the Enduro24, and it is on up here at the servo arm, which is an Emax. It has an SCX24, or does it? I can't remember. That's, I believe, yeah, that's an SCX24 ball joint, and it fit inside of the Enduro drag link end, which is actually a suspension link. This end down here, though, is from an Enduro24, this ball joint. And I had to just basically figure out where that needed to be and drill a hole in it. And I actually drilled a hole using a hot needle. I got it orange hot, and then just poked it through, and then widened the hole with my pin files until it was adequate for the ball joint threads to go into. So that was a little bit of fabrication on that piece there. And we'll move to the bottom of the car. And up front, you can see the only real modification other than the axle I made is the SCX24 hot racing drive shaft. This is from a C10, and it bolts right in. It's pretty nice. Everything else here, these are stock Enduro24 links. I did make them high clearance. I put a nice bend in them just to get them up off the rocks, and that works pretty well. I've also tapered these corners, and the reason I did that was if you don't taper them, they have a sharp 90-degree angle, and they will not allow for much rotation. That 90-degree angle is like a hinge right here and right here, and if you know your door hinge doesn't pivot, like the door to your bedroom, you'll notice those hinges don't pivot because they only can move in one plane. So by rounding these out, they are able to move and do a bit more rotating and pivoting. And tight tolerances are not necessary on a small crawler like this. One of the things that really made this nice and gave it a lot of performance gains is the Deadbolt rear suspension. And I have a video that shows how I bend these and maintain the same distance from end to end. I'll put that in the link as well. But it's important if you do this that they remain the same length even with the bends. These will actually stretch a bit as you heat them. And I was doing that. This is a Deadbolt rear drive shaft, and this end is fine because you're hooking it from an SCX24 part to an SCX24 part. That's perfect. It works great. Don't touch this end. However, on the transmission side up in here, which I don't know if you can see that, I had to use the end yoke, this part here, on this end from the Enduro24, because an SCX24 end yoke will not fit onto the output shaft from the transmission. It's too small and it won't go on. It's kind of frustrating. But what I did was I just took the end yoke off of the ball joint. This just pretend for a minute that this is the other side and hooking into the transmission. I took this part off. I saved this ball joint. It's still there. That ball yoke is still SCX24, and I put the Enduro piece on because it bolts right onto the transmission. So I did have to open the holes up a little bit because the little pins that stick out of the ball yoke on the Enduro24, they're so small that as soon as you go with the 2S battery, it will just blow them out and drop your transmission, your drive shaft on the ground. It almost instantaneously on rocks. It'll throw it right on the ground. So in order for those to basically pivot the way they need to, the holes need to be expanded. And when you expand them, expand them towards the transmission side, because if you were to expand this hole here, this pivot hole, you'd want to extend it this direction where there's more meat. You don't want to extend it this way or you'll weaken that link. But extend it into the area where you have more plastic. So that works pretty well. Trying to think about what else. That's pretty much it. All I'm going to do that hasn't been done to this thing is add some those axle weights that I showed you for the +4 and some wheel weights, and if possible I might remove those +4s as long as it maintains adequate side hilling with that additional weight on the no, I probably won't. It's pretty hard to pull those out. I mean, it takes a long time. The back axle is really easy. You can swap +4s in and out in minutes, but the front one, you got to take a lot of stuff apart. I probably won't do it. I'll probably just leave it wider, as long as I don't have any clearance issues with my diff or trails that are so narrow that it just won't fit on there with that +4 and +4 here. It's 8 millimeters wider. It's not significant, but it is basically half the tire width. If you draw a line here to here, that is the difference in the width and from what it was. So a few more wheel weights, and as far as I know, this is a completed project. This thing was the one that climbed at 73 degrees, and with that new motor, it recovered a lot of the top speed that it lost when I upgraded to the Scx24 Axles. And like I said, it did make it slower. The only bad thing about doing a brushless motor on this that's been so fast is it's pretty loud. And I guess I also didn't mention this in this video, but I mentioned it in previous videos. Nick at Wolfram RC is getting me, we already have the bearings instead of bushings for the small gear in here, and we've got the bigger bearings on the way for it, and there's probably bushings inside this too instead of bearings. So at some point I will make sure that these both have bearings instead of bushings, and it's not a big deal, but it'll make it a lot quieter when it runs it at high speed. But that is the Enduro SCX24 mod. Hope you guys enjoy the video, and we'll see y'all later.